Welcome back to the Ladakh Literature Festival 2020. Our session for today is Writing on Partition, Memory and Longing, a discussion between Karuna Ezra and Aanchal Malhotra, chaired by Resh Susan. Resh Susan is a freelance writer who writes primarily on books and culture. She runs the Book Satchel, an assorted cultural blog featuring books, films, art, creativity, and mindful living. Karuna is a poet and a writer, former television anchor and model known widely for her activism. Her writing has featured in Vogue, Wire, Outlook, Tehelka, First Post, Open, and Lonely Planet. The Heart Asks Pleasure First is her first novel. Aanchal Malhotra is an oral historian and author of Remnants of a Separation, a history of the partition through material memory, shortlisted for the British Academy's 2019 Naif Al-Rodan Prize for Global Cultural Understanding, the Hindu Lit for Life Non-Fiction Prize, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay NIF Book Prize, and the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize. She is the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory and she currently lives in Delhi. In this panel, writers Aanchal Malhotra and Karuna Ezra Parikh talk about the partition, memories that linger, and the people who live in the aftermath of the largest mass migration in the history of human existence. Similarities that make us human and man-made divisions that induce longing, friendship, love, and also about memories passed on by people and material objects that survive to tell this tale.
And welcome to this panel, Writing on Partition, Memory and Longing. Both Karuna and Aanchal, they are friends and their work is informed by a common theme, which is partition and the consequences of partition. So to begin with, I'd like to start with a portion in Karuna's book, which is just released this year. So here's the book. So this is the story of an Indian Hindu girl meeting and falling in love with a Pakistani Muslim boy. And the irony being that they are meeting in the colonizer's land, which is UK. So there was this one portion in the book that really stood out to me. It is when Daya has fallen sick and she's really tired and she's sleeping. And when she wakes up, there's a platter of food in front of her. And she's really happy to see the Indian food. And later, Aftab corrects her by saying it's not Indian food, it's Pakistani food. So can we start with that? What are the similarities, that bind us, even though we are two different countries?
Yeah, that's such an interesting thing that you noticed, Rish, because that actually did happen to me with Pakistani friends. And so that's an incident taken straight from my life. And I remember I said, "Oh my God, I really miss Indian food." And their response was a little tongue in cheek, and they just said, "Pakistani food, you mean?" And we debated after that with my friends, my Pakistani friends, and we said, "So what's the difference?" And I think, this one incident is so symbolic of, the entire melding of these cultures and the division of these cultures, because what is the difference really, and when it comes down to it, why are those differences focused on much more than the similarities, which are so many that I could call that food Indian food, and it's technically the same thing. And I do talk about this in the rest of the book, where I don't know if you remember, there's this part where I said, how did a religion become so much more and hold so much more weight than a shared history, a shared language, a shared clothing, a shared culture of every kind, and music, and more than that, memories. We have shared memories, and so I think my work and Anchal's as well is so much an exploration of those memories and how you can't divide those memories, and that's what hurts, I think, about partition. And I think if any of us, most of us, go back a few generations, we tend to find these stories in our families, in our friends' families, and it's it's so recent, and it's still so relevant. And I think it is even more relevant looking at what our country is going through right now, perhaps, with so much divisive energy around at this time. So yeah, I think my work as well as Anchal's tries to focus on the similarities rather than the differences. And yeah, yeah, I'll say that much for now. And tell me, what else do you think your work does? Uh,
Aanchal? So even your work and your research was very personal, like Karuna talked about families and stuff.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that there's a couple of levels that you find yourself reacting to the similarities because on one hand, you're listening to people who lived through partition and they're telling you the similarities. They're telling you that we were together and for the most part there was harmony and there is a shared language, there is a shared culture. But then on the other hand, you physically are able to cross the border. Like when I was doing research for my work, I went to Pakistan several times, and then to be confronted with that similarity in such a stark way, and to be sometimes, some people would think that you're from there. Like there, I think for most North Indians at least, even the physical similarity is very less. So there would often be times when someone would ask me if I'm from Karachi or if I'm from Lahore itself when I was there in the city. And I felt such happiness and such joy because how can you tell the difference? You
It,
can't,
it
right?
didn't feel like another country, it just felt like an extension, right?
Yes, but I feel like that's partly because of the mindset that I carried with me. So say I was influenced by the media, I was influenced by the image I read in the newspaper. If I was scared, then perhaps I wouldn't have had the experiences and the chances to speak to the people that I did. But I mean, I'm telling you, Resh, like I was 23 and the first time I went to Pakistan was by myself. And there was not a single bone of fear in my body because I was so excited. All four of my grandparents were from there. They told me stories, and I heard of hundreds of other stories from people. And you want to see where you are from. And the fact that you're there and someone can mistake you for a person who's actually from there, from that soil, I felt like that added another layer of like you physically,
Intimacy.
yeah, you sow yourself into the land in some way, right? So I like Karuna asked some very pertinent questions in her book, like how can you tell the difference? And the food incident you brought up is just one of them, because I know that like her having friends who are Pakistani, there is this tongue in cheek always, like with little things, with your clothes, with your food, with even your words, right? So I think immediately when you are confronted with a person who is either Pakistani or Indian or from the other side of the border, it becomes personal very fast. And it's very difficult to keep it that political image that is shown to you through the media. It's very difficult to retain that then.
Yeah, so can we talk a little more about borders? Like Anchal, in your book, you have very intimate real life stories of people who were affected by partition, and same with Karuna. Karuna's is basically an India-Pakistan love story. So, what is your perception of borders? Like not just the geographical ones, but the cultural ones and the cultural exchange that happens between two countries. Anchal, you can start.
Okay, okay. So I always look at it like this, like the border between India and Pakistan, and we must take this as a preface for all conversations about India and Pakistan. The border between our countries is a man-made border, which means that it is a non-natural border. And that in itself, if you take the literal meaning of non-natural, that means it's not supposed to be there. It was put there, which obviously means that an undivided land is the natural land. Everything that comes after 47 is divided. And how, I mean, I always think of it like this. Every time I'm standing at Wagah or any other border that divides India and Pakistan, there is only 6 inches that divide us, 6 inches of white painted line. That's it. There's nothing else. And it takes barely a second to cross that line. And I'm telling you, with having crossed it several times, when you're on the other side, you can't tell that you're on the other side because it looks very similar. And what I always think about is, and I know Karuna may agree with me because she is a soul of nature, the trees that grow from one side to the other, or the birds that fly from one side to the other, or how the sun shines in the same way on India and Pakistan, at least in the borderlands. How is it possible to divide all that? It's not. And so I find that the construct of the border is actually incredibly man-made, because when I'm talking to someone from there, or even when I'm talking to like Karuna and I have these conversations all the time, even when we are talking about our friends and our relations and our feelings about the other side, it just feels like we're talking about one land. That being said, you can't disregard the fact that at 1947, so many things were ruptured and divided, including the things you mentioned: culture, land, population, homes. But the thing is, how do you carry that memory of that division? Do you carry it with hatred and bitterness, or do you carry it with the hope of that one day maybe this border will not seem so concrete anymore because of the conversation and the empathy that has gone into, rekindling ties?
Oh, that's a very beautiful way of putting it. Karuna, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I had so many thoughts while listening to you, Aanchal, and it's true, we discuss this all the time, and yet there's always new ideas around it. So, of course, my book and my story had to be set in a space where the border didn't matter, right? Because it's really interesting that we are countries that share a border, and yet we never actually encounter each other in our daily life. And I've said this repeatedly while talking about the book, that I was more likely to actually meet a French person or a Polish person, or any other ethnicity, rather than a Pakistani person in India. So I grew up not having met anyone from Pakistan, despite our physical proximity to this country. And so I needed to set my story in a land away from these borders. So I needed to kind of banish the border in order to make them encounter each other, my two protagonists. And I find that heartbreaking because, despite this 6 inches, as you put it, that's crazy when you think about that. Despite this, yeah, this very tiny sort of space between the two lands, I do feel that it is so vast. And I think that's where, you spoke about memory. And, for me, that's also where the longing comes in, right? Because anyone who I speak to in India who has an open mind to these things is dying to know what Pakistan is like. And anyone I speak to from Pakistan is fascinated to hear more about India. And it's this denial, this years and years of denial now of the other, that has, of course, created this idea of longing. And, I've never had the pleasure of visiting Pakistan, despite having so many close Pakistani friends. But I totally believe you, Angela, because your story is not isolated. Anyone I speak to from India who's been to Pakistan feels such kinship there and feels a sense of home there. And that is really beautiful because, what is the border but a line, as you said? And what is this line but completely man-made, and therefore in the structure of the universe quite imaginary, actually? It's something that we have imagined up, and it's not the best of our imagination, let's say. Um, so I find that concept of longing so beautiful. Daya and Aftab have just made love, and Daya is kind of heartbroken, and she says to Aftab, every time we make love, we're crossing borders. And he says, no, Daya, every time we make love, we are rejoining lands. Um, and that's how I feel about it. This concept of borders that actually should be banished. So yeah.
Do you find that the public memory is different from the recorded history? Like, for example, for me, the history that we learn in textbooks felt quite reductive, because it just felt like, this year something happened, this year something happened, and that's all. Like, we don't think so much about it. It's just a date and some event happening. But when I read Aanchal's book about, real people telling their stories, being separated from their families, having to leave homes and make new homes, there's a portion where somebody is thinking whether spending 2 rupees on ice cream is an extravagant expense. And yeah, and then there's another portion where, somebody is earning 600 rupees, and that's a very big amount in those times. Or people are smuggling, it might seem inconsequential to us, but for them, it holds a lot of value, like something like a necklace or, a vessel or something across the border. All those stories makes this partition and the way we look at it so much more human and so much more bigger than what we learn in our history textbooks, which is just maybe one line, one paragraph about this happened, and that's it. We move on to the next. So Aanchal, when you were working on your book, did you find that the public memory is different from what is recorded? Like, is there a deviation?
I feel like you answered that question. But I think what struck me was when I learned it in school, and I would say I went to a pretty good school in Delhi, and I studied the NCERT curriculum, and I know Karuna did as well. I was pretty surprised that when we studied partition, it didn't feel like it belonged to me. And independence didn't feel like it belonged to me. It felt like words on a page. So it's a two-part problem. It's not just the fact that it was being reducted into numbers and statistics. It was also the fact that the way we were being taught it didn't make it feel like our history. So as a result, when I started actually speaking to people who had lived through partition, the enormity of humanity dawns on you, right? And Resh, you said it very rightly, like you read the things in remnants and you feel like partition was a human event. But partition has always been a human event because humans were affected by it. By saying 15 million people displaced, you are reducing each one of those people to a number. But I think what we need to remember is behind each number, there is a story. And the interesting thing about partition is that for these stories, you may hear one kind of story, and I know that the media and a lot of books have vocalized the violence of that time and made it into the dominant narrative. But you will always find other kinds of stories as well. Stories about love, stories about friendship, stories about sacrifice, stories about extreme pain. I think that what really bothers me is how the media and Bollywood in particular has painted partition as a photograph of trains and train stations and people sitting on trains and people killing one another. And I feel like this has really dominated our imaginations when it comes to partition, and that perception needs to change. So whether it is Aftab and Daya's story, which in itself is so intimate and unique, and I can tell you firsthand that such stories existed even then, or it is a story of someone, as you said, getting 600 rupees, or someone not being able to make ends meet when they crossed over. I feel like all of these stories are important to hear because it does many things. It returns partition to storytelling. It returns partition to us. We feel like we own it. We feel like we can hold it. We feel like it's our history. And this needs to change in the way we teach it in school as well. And the second thing that happens is a semantic shift. People who live through partition always call themselves partition victims because they feel like they lost something. They lost land or home or family or stature. But the thing is, they're partition survivors because they survived and were able to not just restart their lives in many different ways, but also, have successful subsequent generations. So I feel like by talking about the stigma around the word refugee, which exists in all cultures across India, I feel, and maybe the world, but talking about the refugee experience of partition reduces the stigma around it, which makes people take ownership over their stories and pass the stories along. And we become from victims to survivors, which, is a complete mindset shift, I think.
Like, I'm sure when you were doing your research, you must have come across, discouraging point of view or people who were angry about the whole thing. But there are also many heartwarming stories. Like I read there was something about a house. You helped. Yeah. So can you just share about, people who were really against it?
Right. I do want to say that just because we have lovely stories doesn't mean we disregard all the uncomfortable ones.
Yes.
Because we can't choose with memory, right? We have to acknowledge both. Like
Mm-hmm.
even when you're talking to someone like Karuna and me, we may have a lot of things to say about empathy and kindness, but someone who is in a similar age group to us may have everything to say about bitterness and divisiveness. And we need to understand the root of why both things exist and both things coexist. So the story of the house is there was a family living in a house in Dalhousie, and at the time of partition, Dalhousie was a Muslim dominant area. And there were all these upper class Muslim families that had beautiful big mansions. And interesting thing about Dalhousie is that it fell in Gurdaspur district, which was supposed to have gone to Pakistan. And so in Gandhi Chowk in Dalhousie, the flag of Pakistan went up on August 14. And then when it was transferred actually to India, the flag of India went up, which meant that from August 14 to 17, the Muslim families there thought they were safe. But on August 17, what you had is this big caravan of Muslim families leaving Dalhousie because they were completely unprepared to now have been in India. And so they were finding their way to Pakistan. Such is the case of a Muslim family that left a house called Kehkeshan, which the word means. And so they left this beautiful house that this man had been building for years and years. And they went to Pakistan and they set up a house there. And when I met the daughter of the man in Lahore, she kept talking about this house. She kept lamenting about this house, Kehkeshan in Dalhousie. And, I think at the time I didn't pay a lot of attention to the story of the house when I was in Lahore because I was looking for objects that people had carried across partition, and a house is not something that you can touch, particularly if it's a house from memory. So I mentioned a little bit about the house in my book, and then the book was published, and I almost completely forgot about it. And then 2 months after the book was out in 2017, this Sikh gentleman gets in touch with me and says that this house you've written about, Kehkeshan, this is my house. I live in it now. And I swear I couldn't believe the serendipitous. I just couldn't believe it. I burst out crying. I called a woman in Lahore and I said that I found your house. I see your house. I can, she had not seen her house in 70 years and she's so sweet. She says to me, "Oh, I hope they send us some photographs of the house." And I said that they're going to do a lot more than that. And I ended up going to Dalhousie. It's about a 12-hour drive from Delhi. I ended up going there. I ended up living in that house for a week. I ended up making the family Skype. And it was actually kind of incredible because it wasn't a Hindu family meeting a Sikh family or a Muslim family meeting a Sikh family. It was just two families that shared this history of this house. And it felt incredible. I think one of the things that we cannot disregard when we do this kind of work is how much it is built by the people and how much it is for the people. So even though you may be the person who's unearthed this history and is writing this history and you're the reason that it's come out, I feel like it has really nothing to do with you because it's about connecting people on both sides of the border, and that is so and nothing can compare to that.
So, how do you navigate these realms of longing and memory as people living today or as creators? Like Aanchal just said, she uses tangible objects and they become remnants of one intangible history. So, what about you, Karuna? How was it like, the research for the book? And also, you have wings as a symbol, constant symbol in your book. So, can you tell us a bit more about that?
So the wings kind of just worked their own way into the story, and I think many writers, especially of fiction, will have told you this as well that some things happen beyond your control when you're writing, and the wings were one of those things. But it kind of struck me while Aanchal was speaking earlier, and she mentioned about birds, flying across the border, and I do think actually you've written about that as well, right, Aanchal? And that really struck me because it is winged creatures that can move across the borders seamlessly, kind of. And I was very also struck by, what Anshul was speaking about right now about storytelling and language. And I think that I don't want to call it a weapon. I'd rather maybe call it a balm. But I do think that's what storytelling is in this case, especially with partition. And I like what you were talking about in terms of the semantics of moving from, say, victim to survivor of partition. And for me, it's about using the language of love. And I think so much of our shared work, Anshul, and yeah, definitely my personal work, is learning how to wield the language of love, to tell these stories in a gentler fashion. And of course, these stories have always existed. You know, these stories took place a very long time ago, but we are recording them through the lens of love, I think. And I think that makes all the difference. And I do think that the way one tells a story paves the path for other stories. Like you just spoke about this house, and I love that tale so much. For example, uh, when you're telling stories about a couple, a cross-border love story, you pave the path for other people to tell their stories of that kind as well. And that's what I've started seeing happening with my work. Even though it's a work of fiction, I see, it's probably a fraction of what you have seen in the last few years, Anshul, but I've seen so many people in the last few months starting to reach out to me and write to me and say, this is my story, and it has so many echoes of Diane Aftab's story. And I find that really beautiful. And that is the weapon or the balm, let's say, and that storytelling is. And I do think that, Bollywood and other narratives that have been to blame in the past for painting partition in the language of violence have made it okay to only tell other stories of violence. So, for example, if someone had a story of love or kindness from partition that kind of brought two religions together or didn't speak in that language of hatred and violence, I don't think they would have felt confident to tell that story in the past because they might have been thought of as a traitor to the country, or they might have been called names for it, or there might have been an aura of shame around not having that hatred as well. And I love that we are telling stories in the language of love now so that we open the doors to more stories being heard of that kind. And I think you do change the energy around the past like that, even though the stories have taken place ages ago. It's how you record them now. And one of the interesting things that I've seen recently, which is really coincidental but kind of serendipitous as well, is I'm sure you guys have seen it, the India Love Project that has just come up on Instagram, documenting stories of different religions, couples of different religions coming together across India. And I just feel like, you kind of raise the vibration like this. And not to say that my work caused that, but I do think that there are so many of us working towards that kind of narrative now, and you see like a sort of national change place, believe in telling stories differently, finding each other, and in its own way, it becomes a movement of gentleness and love and storytelling in the language of love. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think such projects are really important because there's so much of disharmony between religions and so much on your face hatred. Two fictional characters kissing is a big problem because they both are from different religions, but there was no outrage over, many other things that actually deserve our outrage, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it can be quite disturbing actually to see, and it's heartwarming actually to find people like yourselves and the people doing the India Love Project and who stand up against it. And like I said, I think that it's I think our work, especially for me as a fiction writer, Anchal's work, of course, is research and it's very work. As some most people don't think of fiction as important in that way, but to tell this story became so urgent for me in these last few years. It started out as a love story, and it kind of gained more and more urgency as I wrote it in these last few very important years, politically speaking. So yeah.
Yeah, so we are in this age of social media, and both of you are active in different platforms. So, do you think like social media or Instagram, they can be something more like a repository of history and culture as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anchal's the best person to answer this because of the way she has used her social media so beautifully with it. I, of course, try to balance it out and put out these ideas. But I love what she's doing, not just with her own page, but also with the Museum of Material Memory. Anchal, I honestly think you should answer this one. Like it's, yeah.
Um,
Anchal, please.
yes, I would love to, but before that, Karna, what you were speaking about fiction versus non-fiction, I have to say that I'm very envious of novelists because sometimes I think when you're writing, when you're writing history, when you're writing politics, when you're writing non-fiction, um, I mean, you're putting forth real life stories, but I feel somehow the impact in fiction is way more and it's longer lasting. And fiction is able to cut into skin, go to bone, and kind of stay there, because like I may forget lots of things I have read in non-fiction text, but the story of Aftab and there is with me, and it's with me quite strongly, like even the things that they say or what they feel, because I think that fiction allows us for that space. It allows us to make the personal political, and vice versa, of course, the political personal. In terms of social media,
And I think I'll just interrupt you here. I think you were talking about seeing the partition with different perspectives, and I think Karuna's book is a very good example of that because partition, it's something very violent, it's very sad, but Karuna's book is all about beauty, love, and it also addresses these difficult questions.
well, I was now kind of we're just going to be speaking about you as if you're not here. But I was sent the manuscript to blurb it, and I think that what I took away from that was that Karuna's novel speaks to, it's a testament to a possible world. It shows us that certain things are possible. And I wrote this in my blurb also. It sews up a subcontinent divided. And it does it with tenderness and it does it with affection. And it's not that it's not uncomfortable, because there are several things in it that make you very uncomfortable, particularly when you're confronted with religion being the primary mode of identification for many people, and suddenly you don't know what to say, and somebody is always the other in this circumstance. But I feel it is a testament to a possible world, and I think it resonated so much with me. And it may be a love story, but it is also testament to our history, you know. Um, so clearly, I'm a huge advocate for Karuna's work. Um, Coming to the question about social media.
Much. I
Yes, Karuna.
was going to say, all these things about fiction versus non-fiction, and I would argue with you, but I know your own fiction book is coming out soon, so I'm going to let you speak with great authority about fiction now.
Yeah, I mean,
So
this
thank
is how, I notice it in my own work also, and so I feel like on one hand, to be envious is something that you yourself are doing. Um, but to speak of social media and what actually, this is very important, and I think that for the larger part of the conversation about digital media, social media gets a really bad rep because it is like the breeding ground for trolls and robots and all that stuff. But on the other hand, it is, when we speak about it in the case of Partition, it is one of the only ways in which so many people can go back or see where families are from, visibly see it. If you can't touch it, if you can't walk on the soil, then you can actually see where someone is from and you can hear stories from that land. And I feel in that sense, social media is a huge resource for us. There have been innumerable stories that I have posted online on Instagram and Twitter where I have said, oh, this story is from, say, Multan. And then someone from Multan will write and say, I'm from Multan. Where is the story from? I can help the person find their house. And this happened just recently, so it's very vivid in my mind. But I feel like social media it can be a tool to use to our advantage in this way.
And it's also developing a kind of harmony and community, right?
Right, right. because all of a sudden people can speak to an Indian or a Pakistani, and it's not a mythical, fictional, imaginary character anymore. It's like a real person.
Yeah, actually dissolving borders, what we started with in the beginning.
Yeah, I was just going to say, who would have thought that social media is the borderless world that we all dream of?
Yes, so I think we are nearing our ending time. So would you like to give us a few recommendations, anything related to partition or just anything you've been enjoying recently? Karuna?
Gosh, I've spent a lot of the last year reading a bunch of classics and rereading classics and
Yeah, me
uh,
too. There's such a comfort in, this
really,
lockdown and stuff.
yeah. The only thing is that for a writer of fiction, it sometimes makes me feel like all the best writing has already been done. So yeah, but some of my old favorites, Anna Karenina. I read Kim for the first time, which I actually thought was a glorious look at India at the time. I also read a few of the really hefty ones. For anyone stuck at home and watching this, we have so much time on our hands right now. So I did Suitable Boy, and I did Sacred Games, and I reread the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, and so I found a lot of comfort in these old novels and kind of
Chunky books.
classics. Yeah, and like I said, we have the time now. But in terms of books that I've found really remarkable recently, there's a book called Chernobyl Prayer, which I actually think that you read it recently, right? I think I saw that you were recommending it somewhere as well, and it has been beautiful reads that I've had recently. And surprisingly, the one that I'm definitely going to recommend, especially for this winter, is Wind in the Willows, because it's my go-to comfort book, and so I'm going to recommend that. So yeah.
Perfect, wonderful. What about you, Aanchal?
Well, I would piggyback a little on Karna and say Svetlana Alexievich is my go-to like almost any day, any time of the year. And it's a bit depressing to say that because all of her books are so heavy, but I feel like she is the best entry into oral history.
Really, she's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, Chernobyl Prayer is great. Unwomanly Face of War is incredible. So I recommend her all the time. And she really set up the field of oral history in some way and what a woman could do in that field. Of course,
Yeah.
in India we have our own incredible equivalents of Urvashi Bhutalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin. So those are other recommendations. But for the past couple of months, I have been reading things I've already read before and new things. So, Resh, I know that you may agree with me when I say IQ84 is amazing, and I read it again this year, also a tome of a book. But I also read Memory Police, and This Is How We Disappeared.
It's a very bleak read.
Which one?
The Memory Police.
It's funny you say that because I found it incredibly vibrant.
Oh,
Because I think it's so much about forgetting and also like kind of forced forgetting.
Mhm.
And it really informed the way I thought about a lot of the objects that I wrote about in Remnants,
Mhm.
especially the objects that people wish they had carried but never could.
Mhm.
Because it's all about things that disappear. And then other books I would recommend are William Dalrymple's City of Gins. I think is like a classic for everyone to read.
Yeah.
And All the Light We Cannot See.
Oh, I love that. And I know you love that too. I really want to read it again. It's so beautiful, that book.
I
Karuna,
think
have you read it, Karuna?
No, it's on.
Definitely should. You definitely should because both of us are recommending it now.
yeah,
I'll
I
100% do it.
want to go back into a time when I hadn't read it so I can read it for the first time as well.
Exactly.
So the title actually reminds me of another fantastic book that I read called In the Light of What We Know. And I actually would recommend that in terms of partition, but a different partition, which is the Bangladesh side of the story. And I actually found that a really, really powerful, incredible book when it comes to partitions that and the sides of partition that we often forget and don't talk about. And I just want to say that, Aanchal, I love Svetlana, but you are still my favorite oral historian.
That is a compliment. That's a
I-
huge compliment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the recommendation. So we are nearing the end of our session. And if you'd like to explore books on how religion and geographical borders separated people of a common heritage, I would recommend Anchal Malhotra's Remnants of a Separation, non-fiction, real-life stories, tearjerker. I cried so many times reading this. And Karuna's The Heart Asks Pleasure First, which is all sorts of beautiful, very lyrical, very poetic, and it's a love story. So thank you so much, Aanchal and Karuna, for this session.